Chapter 22, Social Change in the Global Community, is the chapter that we'll be talking about today. And from this first slide, you can see all the topics that we want to cover in this recording. So theories of social change, resistance to social change in a global capacity, technology in the future, and then transnationals and social policy globalization. So here's our questions we want to consider, some good things to keep in mind and how we can answer them after looking at all this information. How does social change occur, or how does it happen? Is the process of social change unpredictable, or can we make certain generalizations about it? And has globalization contributed to social change? Our next slide gets into the theories of social change. And so when we mention social change, we just talk about or referring to that there are significant changes over time, that the way people deal with things. And so maybe a good example of that is in the past, because of the lack of medical technology, when people got sick and ill, there was really nothing that can be done to extend their lives or to slow down the rate of disease progression, and so they died a whole lot earlier. Now we can keep people alive, their bodies alive for long periods of time, but it brings into play the quality of life. So, we can keep the body alive, but at the risk of having to decide, whether we want to be comatose or in a vegetative state. That's a good example of social change. The digital age is another example there of social change. So those are just a couple quick ones to kind of give us something to think about in terms of what this social change refers to. Evolutionary theory is next, and it's really talking about change again, but as a whole, as a society, from one to the next. And we can think there's an example of going from pre-industrial to industrial and post-industrial. Those are all big changes there, and has really changed just about everything and for those societies as a way of life. Functionalist theory, or under that we have equilibrium model. But for example, you change in one area leads to change in other parts. It's an adjustment so that everything balances out. Alright, so more with functionalist theory here. And so our theorist is Parsons, and talked about the four processes of social change that you see on the slide that are also emphasized in the book, with differentiation, adaptive upgrading, inclusion, and value generalization. Alright, another theory of social change is conflict theory. That's Karl Marx, but in keeping with the overall perspective of this theory is that there are inequalities that need to be corrected, and so that's the overall theme of conflict theory. No surprise there. And so this, instead of being passive change, would be more of an active change. And so some would say that both the functionalist and the conflict approaches are actually compatible. Alright, so this is just a snapshot that shows change in the United States over about a 150-year period. And so you can see all the different categories. We've got 6 different categories, starting with population, education, labor force participation, health, technology, and family. And then from selected years that are over 100 to 150 years ago. And you can see just as the chapter is talking about change, and the slide is called A Changing Nation. So, lifespan, for example, we see, or under health here, in 1850, 38. Someone can expect to be 38 years old, and now it's almost up to 80. Alright, so with cultural change and social change, that seems to be good things, but sometimes there is resistance to change. People may be a little bit hesitant to accept things because after all, they've done them in a certain way before, and that creates a lot of unknown. Alright, so that's the first part of the slide, is people sometimes meet with resistance. Maybe cultural lag is also an appropriate thing to consider, because that goes back to our idea of how do you deal with something. You may have the technology to make it possible, but maybe you haven't thought on it morally or ethically, and maybe still having to decide what to do there. Would you clone yourself, for example, and have extra spare body parts in case you needed them? The issue there is, do you impede on another life to save your own? So that's maybe a good example of cultural lag, and with the change there that could occur, that people are going to have to weigh the pros and cons against. All right, so vested interest, people who will suffer in the event of social change. All right, we also, with this resistance to technology, there's a group of people who were really anti-technology. They're known in history as the Luddites, and really there's some questions about who the founder is of that. And but anyway, and the word sabotage was they would actually go out, and one of the first things they did was there was a shoe factory, and they basically kind of destroyed it, the ability there for the factory to continue production. And so that's actually how the word sabotage has come into existence. Now, technology itself, a broad definition of that is anything used to help solve life's challenges or cope with the world's demands. So that's maybe one definition there, but also, as you can see here listed on our slide, about how to use material resources to satisfy our needs and desires. So they're both pretty close. One's more a little broad and generic than the other one that's here on our screen. All right, so some people with the industrialization did not welcome it. When we talk about it, it seems to be like it was universally accepted, but that's not the case, as this slide's kind of pointing out. All right, on our next slide we have global social change. And so, you may have the idea that we have social change when things aren't going well. That's not necessarily the case. And we have some one reference there to the book that talks about in the late 80s, the collapse of the former Soviet Union was predicted there. And because a lot of the resources there just were being spread too thin, is really what Collins would argue there. All right, so if you're a group of sociologists, how would you predict these things, and how accurate could your predictions be about these major shifts that go on globally? All right, an example of all of this is in Dubai, but Middle Eastern nation there, Arab state, that really had heavily invested itself in as oil reserves, and then after that, ability to free trade. Before that, it was really kind of a fishing place, and so it has really changed over the years. One report had called it the richest city in the world, and you can see some of the benefits there that citizens enjoyed for a time. And then, when the good times were rolling, lots of people there were coming in and wanting to live there and experience this all the good things that the city had to offer. But then things kind of went south economically, and in 2009, just as fast as it had been built up, it actually kind of decreased, and many people left. There was a lot of price controls that just went outrageous, that people couldn't afford. And our book mentions, for example, one home designed for a single family, over 500 laborers were living in there, and of course that was something that was unsafe conditions and had to have that rectified. All right, the government there mentioned on the slide had little oversight of working or living conditions in the nation, and so again they had some economic downturn, and that affected quite a number of people at the rate of 5,000 leaving a day. All right, what about technology in the future? So there's lots of again good things that technology has brought, and maybe we can also think of some negatives there, but overall how it has changed life in a dramatic way. All right, just here in terms of the internet, and by 2010, not quite 2 billion users. So in a world population of 7 billion, really not even a third of people have access, according to our chart here. Where internet access is dominant would be those wealthier nations. So those core nations we've seen in another slide is compared to the periphery and those on the semi-periphery. All right, so maybe a good question there. How often do you encounter a website that is you can get the content in a foreign language or a language that you do not read or speak? And how much has Chinese websites? How, when you surf the web, do you encounter those quite a bit? So it's something you can answer if it is or if it isn't, one way or the other. All right, now talking about technology and how this can affect the future, a little bit of genetics mentioned here. So in terms of, designer children, maybe sometimes it's called that or something similar to that, to where you can determine or choose the sex of your child or maybe some other characteristics that are important to you. And these advances have come off the backs of beginning steps, baby steps with animals, and that we've read about, for example, Dolly the sheep and other things like this, and maybe some fanciful media ideas with some movies and things like that. The Island comes to mind, where you kept your clone in case something happened to you, and then they took whatever body parts you needed off these clones in order to make you better again. All right, our food is modified genetically, and so if you ever get a chance, there's a documentary called Food Inc., but it talks a little bit about how the majority of foods are genetically modified, and so is that actually good for people or not? The Human Genome Project, you're probably familiar with that, but that has been mapped and to where they talk about all the potential problems that a person could have and where they're actually located according to this information. All right, how can, for example, we change traits through genetic engineering? Before you're born, could you have surgery before you're born to help correct a problem? Or, like earlier we mentioned there, specific traits that you're looking for, can you have those and pre-select them when you want to have children? All right, also mentioned the genetically modified food. Now that is something our slide also mentioned. Let me back up once again, but something that needs monitoring to make sure bad things don't happen as well. All right, so another slide here about question and related back again to the Human Genome Project that we've just seen on a slide. What criteria besides the power of a group could be used to determine how much research is done on diseases that affect that group? So that's a good point there. There's been many poor examples in the past where groups in power subjected subordinate groups to mistreatment just to satisfy some of their intellectual curiosity, even when it meant the death of these groups. All right, so second question, what should a researcher do if a tribal leader refuses to allow members of the tribe to participate? Well, I guess that's another interesting question, but that would have some answers there that we could go through. It might vary. I mean, that shouldn't happen, but sometimes you can't plan for those things. All right, what about transnationals, trans or cross, and people who are from one culture but have come to another culture? So we might think of our immigrants or migrant laborers that from one culture come for work in another land that exposes them to another culture. All right, so they have not only the challenges associated with work, but also adapting to a different culture. All right, so our three theories here would have something to say about this issue with transnationals, and so you can see that here with the slide, but all in keeping with those theories that we've been talking about all semester long. All right, and we can also see about social policy. So this slide connects social policy with transnationals. And so we have questions even now about making an immigration policy that's being debated back and forth in Congress, both in the House and Senate, which voter eligibility and other issues of citizenship are being discussed in that bill. And there's plenty of people who are for and against this legislation, so that's why it's been debated, I think, so long and trying to find something that where everybody can say they have some sort of victory in the legislation. All right, and finally here just shows the migration, the labor migration. This final slide, and you can see across the world, the legend here with the purple is the greatest financial amount, and then as it changes colors to the blue and greens, it becomes a little less economically valuable. Now this graph is several years old, so it'd be interesting if we had a more updated one and see if anything had changed or just kind of held the same. Alright, but then the end of the chapter, we're here, and really the name of social change is that things keep changing there, and whether they're either positive or negative. Our chapter has really painted a picture that things were positive, although there were some challenges or issues to also consider. Thank you for your time. I hope this has helped, and if I can help you, just let me know. I'll be glad to clarify anything if I need to. Thank you, and I will talk to you soon.